Good evening. Welcome to Lymphoma Canada's Southwestern Ontario chapter meeting. I'm Mary John Lachance, chair of the chapter. Our chapter is a support group, run by and for lymphoma patients with the goal of giving the lymphoma community a place to connect, share experiences, learn about lymphoma, and support one another. Prior to COVID, we met in person and hope to do so again once it is safe. Our meetings are free and open to the community for the foreseeable future. Our meetings will be virtual the first Wednesday evening of February, May, August, and November. And now, Caitlin, would you please take care of some housekeeping?
Of course. So first, before housekeeping, I'd just like to introduce Lymphoma Canada, just for those that may not be very familiar, although I'm sure many of you are at this point. So Lymphoma Canada is an organization that for about 23 years now has been working together with healthcare professionals across the country, with patients and other organizations and stakeholders to ultimately empower the lymphoma community through education, support, advocacy, and research. So our vision is a life unlimited by lymphoma, and together we work to promote early detection. We help patients access new treatments, learn more about their lymphoma and the many different causes and treatments, and ultimately find a cure. Just to go over a little bit of housekeeping for those that may not be very familiar with the software that we're working with today. The software that we're working with is called GoToWebinar, and to avoid any issues or interruptions, the platform used prevents you from speaking or turning on your camera. However, we are able to interact with you through the Q&A function. So if you'd like to ask a question at any point throughout the presentation, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box. We are going to save all of our questions until the end of the presentation. And myself as the moderator will be asking your question to the presenters to provide a verbal answer back. With the platform as well, we just wanted to be able to collect a little bit more information just for registration tracking purposes. And this, of course, will be anonymous to any of the other attendees. It's just for our purposes. But we'd like to ask if in the actual Q&A section, and again, no one else will see this, it will just come directly to Lymphoma Canada. If you could please provide your lymphoma subtype. You could also let us know if someone is joining you watching this today, such as a caregiver or family or friend, and also just provide their name. That would be great. And also provide just information on the city you're from, just for, again, tracking purposes. We do say often that just for the best experience, we recommend attending this session via a computer. However, you can, of course, still attend with a tablet or iPhone, but it might not allow for all functions. And Mary John?
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. First, we have Natalie Dren, who is the research manager at Lymphoma Coalition. Natalie will give us the results of Lymphoma Coalition's 2020 global survey that hopefully most of us completed. And then we'll have Caitlin, who has been speaking, Caitlin Brafus-Lasky, manager of patient programs, research, and advocacy at Lymphoma Canada. Caitlin will highlight many of the Canadian results. Natalie and Caitlin will respond to your questions at the end of the presentations, but you may submit the questions at any time. Okay, Natalie, please start.
Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So hello everyone, my name is Natalie. I'm the research manager at Lymphoma Coalition. And tonight I'm going to be speaking to you about the experience of patients with lymphoma in Canada and globally. So this is an outline of what I will cover this evening, beginning with some background on Lymphoma Coalition and our global patient survey, and then moving into the patient and caregiver results from the global patient survey, and wrapping up with some conclusions and some goals. Lymphoma Coalition, or LC, is an umbrella organization that was formed in 2002, and it was incorporated as a not-for-profit in 2010. We do not work directly with patients, but we do work with and connect patient organizations from around the world. The patient groups we work with have either a partial or a full focus on supporting patients with lymphomas. And currently, the network we support consists of 82 patient groups in 52 countries around the world. Lymphoma Canada is a member of Lymphoma Coalition. LC acts as a central hub for credible and current information, and we're committed to sharing knowledge and best practices across our membership to move towards equity in lymphoma outcomes across borders. So our current strategy is focused on ensuring impact within the pillars of information and advocacy. The Global Patient Survey on Lymphomas and CLL is an online survey that we conduct every 2 years in partnership with either a scientific body or a survey research institute. In 2020, we worked with Picker Institute Europe to develop and launch the survey, which we hosted on a third-party portal from January to March in 19 languages. There was a patient and a caregiver version of the survey. And in the past, the caregiver version of the survey was just the same survey as the patients answered, but they were answering on behalf of the patient. But for 2020, we decided to create a different version of the survey that asked caregivers about their lived experiences. The patient survey questions broadly covered topics of demographics, information guidance and support, side effects, and barriers to care. So these question themes remain fairly consistent throughout the different years of the survey, but what we will do is change the questions within each section, either slightly or drastically, just depending on the information we would like to collect or based on what we've learned in the years past. The caregiver survey also looked at demographics and information guidance and support, but also looked at the impact of caregiving across different areas of life. The 2020 survey received 11,878 responses, and this included 9,179 patients and 2,699 caregivers. And this was a really big increase from what we saw in 2018, where we had 6,631 respondents total. So we'd like to thank Lymphoma Canada for all their efforts in sharing the survey and encouraging participation, as well as all of the patients who took the time to participate and answer the survey. Something we think had a lot to do with the increased response was allowing LC members to add up to 5 country-specific questions into the 2020 survey. So countries who received 100 or more responses to the 2018 survey were allowed to add these 5 questions, which were specific to things they wanted to know about in their country, about lymphomas and lymphoma care, and then they were able to use that data in their planning and advocacy initiatives. Lymphoma Canada did participate in this and added 1 question to the survey. So some global demographics. This year we had representation from respondents in over 90 countries around the world. Most respondents were from Europe or from Asia Pacific. And we're working with members in Africa to see how we can increase their participation for 2022 because it is quite low. The top 5 countries by response number, so that includes both patients and caregivers together, were China, France, USA, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Canadian respondents made up 6% of the total patient population and 2% of the total caregiver population. And now moving into the patient survey results. So for both the patient and caregiver survey results, the results will be displayed for Canadian respondents and for global respondents. And global respondents just means all the rest of the respondents minus Canadians. And this comparison was done just to see if there were any major differences in the patient and caregiver experiences in Canada compared to the global average. Beginning with patient demographics. So this question about Canadian provinces and territories was the question that Lymphoma Canada added to the survey. Almost half of Canadian patients lived in Ontario and a fifth lived in British Columbia. Then we had 10% Quebec, 8% Alberta, 5% Nova Scotia, and then less than 5% representation from the rest of the provinces and territories. The distribution of sex was almost identical for patients in Canada versus globally. So with about a 60 to 40 female to male split. And this is typically what we've seen year after year in terms of how the sex is distributed. In looking at age, there were more older patients in the Canadian patient population than the global. 2/3 of Canadian patients were 60 to 69 years old or more than 70 years old. Only 6% of Canadian patients were under 39 years old, compared to about a fifth globally. And this could be because the patient group we work with in China has a really large focus on younger patients, as do some groups in Europe that we work with. And patients from Asia Pacific and Europe did make up the biggest portion of patients in the global sample. Since members are marketing their survey to their contacts, it makes sense that these countries have a younger demographic responding. The top lymphoma subtypes represented in Canada were follicular lymphoma, CLL or SLL, Waldenstrom's, and diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. The survey was publicized by the Waldenstrom's Macroglobulinemia Foundation of Canada, which upped the number of respondents with this subtype in Canada because it is quite rare. So it was interesting that we had this big of a response. 3 of these top subtypes were the same for patients globally. So CLL, follicular, and diffuse large B-cell were also in the top for global patients, but Hodgkin lymphoma was more represented in the global sample. And this might explain also why there are more younger people in the global sample, because Hodgkin lymphoma typically affects younger adults. We also asked patients what stage of their experience they were currently in. Around 30% of patients both in Canada and globally were in remission at the time of the survey. The other top 2 stages represented in Canada were patients in active surveillance, which means that the doctors were actively monitoring their condition, but they weren't receiving any treatment unless tests indicated that their condition had changed or worsened. This is sometimes called watch and wait. Active surveillance is a common treatment approach for slow-growing or indolent lymphomas, which were largely represented among Canadian patients. So these would be follicular, CLL, and Waldenstrom's, which we had a lot of in the survey. More patients in the global population were currently in treatment compared to Canadian patients. Because most patients in Canada and globally were in remission at the time of the survey, we wanted to look at how long patients had been in remission. Compared to patients globally, more Canadian patients reported being in longer remissions. So 70% of Canadian patients who were in remission had been in remission for more than 2 years. So that's the 34 plus the 36 in the bottom 2 boxes, compared to just 61% globally, so the 31 and 30 together. And we're always interested to know how long it takes patients to get a lymphoma diagnosis. So we ask patients how long it was from their first appointment with their GP until they got a diagnosis. So they would have gone to their GP about symptoms, and then we're looking at the time frame from that point until when they're actually diagnosed. The largest amount of Canadian patients reported it took less than 3 months to get a diagnosis. So that's the bar at the bottom, which was 46%. But a quarter of Canadian patients waited more than 6 months for their diagnosis. So the top 2 bars together. And you can see that compared to globally, more Canadian patients reported each of the longer wait categories. So the 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12, and 12 plus. And we know that in many jurisdictions across Canada, the provision of cancer services can work using kind of a parallel cancer subsystem. And within that, there can be pretty limited crossover integration with primary and community care. And the fragmented nature of that system can create some challenges when patients need to transition from one system to another. So in diagnosis or then back into survivorship. So this could be contributing to the longer diagnosis times. Also, wait times for certain tests or for access to certain specialists could be contributing to the longer wait times. Most all patients, both in Canada and globally, understood that they were being diagnosed with cancer when they were told they had lymphoma. But there are still many patients not being told their lymphoma subtype at diagnosis. When first diagnosed, we know that many patients will be told they have non-Hodgkin lymphoma, or NHL. But NHL is not a disease. It's a series of 80+ subtypes that all require different diagnostic evaluation and different treatment approaches. And it's critically important that patients be told their subtype at diagnosis in order to better understand what they're being diagnosed with and their treatment options, as well as to help them more effectively source the right information for their disease. In studies that we have done about the value of patients knowing their subtype at diagnosis, those who were informed of their subtype reported better management of their healthcare through improved understandings and improved communication with healthcare professionals. Patients were asked to rate their top 3 choices for information sources throughout their patient experience. The top 3 places patients go for information about their disease, both in Canada and globally, were doctors, websites, and patient organizations. And these are the same top 3 choices we see year after year in the survey, both globally and across many regions and different country breakdowns. Though the majority of patients in Canada and globally reported that they were given the right amounts of information at diagnosis, more than a third of patients in both groups were not given enough information. Through research, we have found that having adequate information is a key aspect to a successful patient experience. And what we mean by that is one where patients feel like they can manage their condition, they experience fewer psychosocial issues, and they communicate well with their healthcare team and are able to get what they need from their team. So sometimes doctors can be afraid to give patients too much information up front just for the fear of overwhelming them. But as you can see, less than 5% of patients in Canada and globally reported being given too much information at diagnosis. So we encourage patients to request more information and resources up front if you feel like you need it, even if you don't use them immediately. In both Canada and globally, patients reported wanting more information within the first month following diagnosis. And in both patient groups, patients wanted more information about treatment options, diagnosis and what it means, and side effects from treatment. So those were the top 3 requested for more information, both Canada and globally. Since doctors are consistently the #1 information source for patients, we ask quite a few questions about how they engage with their doctors and how comfortable they are doing so. Compared to patients globally, slightly more Canadian patients agreed with all of the positive statements about patient-doctor communication listed here. So this was more than 3/4 of Canadian patients agreeing with all of the statements shown in this figure. And Canadian patients seemed to be quite comfortable in their relationship with the doctor, and they had a really high agreeance to more assertive statements about communication. So the last 2 here, by the right, confident in voicing concerns to my doctor, and this is even if the doctor didn't ask, and seeking clarification when they don't understand. And now moving into lymphoma symptoms. So we define lymphoma symptoms as caused by the actual disease rather than caused by the medication that is used to treat it. And these would be the symptoms that are bringing a patient to their GP for a diagnosis, or that they continue to experience during active surveillance or post-treatment if the treatment didn't help resolve these issues. The same top 5 symptoms were reported in Canada and globally, and these were fatigue, abnormal painless swellings, shortness of breath, skin rashes, and B symptoms. And B symptoms is a term that's used to refer to unexplained fever, drenching night sweats, and loss of more than 10% of body weight over 6 months. Compared to patients globally, patients in Canada reported more fatigue, more shortness of breath, and more skin rashes. In terms of how lymphoma symptoms affect patients' day-to-day life, patients in Canada seem to be experiencing larger impacts on their everyday activities, which means groceries, cleaning, laundry, work, etc., and on their social life than on their employment and relationships. So Canadian patients reported everyday activities and relationships on a similar level to those globally, but reported less impact on their employment or their relationships than patients globally. And this could relate to the older patient demographic in Canada. So for example, relating to employment, a lot of the Canadian patients who responded might have already been retired. Those who were currently in treatment or who had ever been treated in the past were asked what treatments they had received. So the top 3 treatments that patients were receiving or had received in Canada were chemoimmunotherapy, steroids, and immunotherapy. And then globally, the top 3 were chemoimmunotherapy, chemotherapy alone, and radiation therapy. And we noticed that compared to patients globally, more patients in Canada had been on targeted therapies, which are often newer or novel treatments for lymphomas. Only 1 patient in Canada reported receiving CAR T therapy, which is usually approved for the treatment of relapse refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, but is being approved for other indications. 31% of patients in Canada got a second opinion about their most recent treatment, which can be seen on the figure on the left, but only 8% changed their primary doctor as a result. So slightly fewer patients in Canada got a second opinion about their most recent treatment, but slightly more in Canada actually changed their doctor as a result than globally. Most patients in Canada reported not wanting or needing a second opinion about their most recent treatment. The top reasons for which are listed on the right, and these were the top 3 reasons, and they were the same in Canada and global. So they trusted their doctor's advice and information, they couldn't access another doctor, or they didn't want to affect the good relationship they had with their current doctor. Overall, most all patients in Canada and globally reported that they trusted the doctors that were treating them, and most all patients in Canada and globally were involved as much as they wanted to be in decisions about their care and treatment. So this was either definitely or to some extent combined. A large majority of patients, so at the top here, 85% in Canada, reported not experiencing any barriers to receiving their treatment. The top 3 barriers to treatment for patients in Canada were the time needed out of daily life, treatment waiting times, and not being able to give up working. So less than 5% of patients in Canada reported any of these top 3 barriers. As you can see, compared to patients globally, fewer patients in Canada reported experiencing most all barriers to treatment. Clinical trials can sometimes present access to patients for the most up-to-date treatments for their subtype. And clinical trials can also present patients with opportunities for new lines of treatment if the standard lines of therapy for their subtype have failed. Only 8% of patients in Canada reported being on or had ever been on in the past a clinical trial. And this was less than the global average, which was 14% on the right. Patients who reported never participating in a clinical trial were asked what barriers to participation they faced. The largest barrier in Canada and globally was never being presented with an opportunity to take part. So that was about 3/4 of patients in Canada. Compared to the global average, more than double the percentage of patients in Canada reported that clinical trial availability was a barrier. We know that the large majority of lymphoma clinical trials in North America occur in the United States, so that could be a contributing factor here. Lastly, not being eligible or selected for a trial was in the top 3 reported barriers. And I should just note that these top 3 were the same for global and Canada, just in a slightly different order. The top 5 treatment side effects for patients in Canada were fatigue, numbness and tingling of limbs, hair loss, changes in sleep, and lack of concentration. The top 5 treatment side effects for patients globally were not the same. They did include fatigue, hair loss, and tingling in limbs, so 3 of them, but included nausea and vomiting and joint and muscle pain instead of changes in sleep and lack of concentration. Fatigue is consistently the top reported side effect across many years of the survey, and we see here that a greater proportion of patients in Canada reported fatigue compared to patients globally. And that is also what we saw in the symptoms section. More patients in Canada reported fatigue as a symptom than patients did globally. These tables display how long the top 5 side effects from Canada lasted for patients in Canada and then compared to globally. Well, it's often that the side effects occur most in the under 1 year category, so the first column after the column that labels the side effects. At least some percentage of patients are reporting the side effects to last in all the other categories, including up to 8 years following treatment. Compared to patients globally, more patients in Canada reported each of their top 5 symptoms to last more in the 8+ years category than in the global. See, each of these numbers are higher than is listed in this figure below. There were more indolent subtypes represented in Canada, so patients are more likely to be living longer with the disease, and this may be why we are seeing high reports of side effects lasting longer in Canada. Regardless, side effects are lasting a really long time for some patients, and something we're continually advocating for is the development of new therapies with more tolerable side effect profiles, but there's still a lot of work to be done here. The need for more tolerable treatment options is also reflected when asking patients to rate important outcomes. These are the top 3 most important outcomes for patients in Canada and globally. They were the same and rated top 3 in the same order. Though a cure is the top rated outcome for patients in Canada and globally, quality of life and fewer treatment side effects to tolerate follow shortly after that. And slightly more patients in Canada rated quality of life and fewer treatment side effects as important compared to globally. It's encouraging to see that most all patients who experienced treatment side effects did discuss them with their doctor, both in Canada and globally. 3/4 of Canadian patients who discussed their treatment side effects with the doctor said that the doctor was able to help, either definitely or to some extent. So this was slightly less than those who said, yes, the doctor was able to help globally, which was 80%. For patients who experienced treatment side effects but did not discuss them with the doctor, the top reported reasons were that they thought they could handle it on their own and that they didn't think it was a big deal. We encourage students to discuss all the side effects they may be experiencing with the doctor, as your medical team can often help. You may have to prioritize what to discuss if you're faced with time constraints, but do let them know what's going on. Not only can this help you cope, but this also helps inform for future patients. As I noted in the slide about patient-doctor communication, patients in Canada are saying they have good conversations with the doctor and that they trust them, so do feel comfortable to speak to them about any issues you may be experiencing. Patients who discussed their treatment side effects and who said the doctor was able to help were asked specifically how the doctor helped. Most patients in Canada and globally reported that the doctor provided medication to help them cope. Many patients also reported that they were provided with further information. But compared to patients globally, fewer patients in Canada were given medication to help cope, and more referred to another source of support. So you can see almost double the patients in Canada were referred to another source of support than was in the global sample. Since fatigue is the top reported lymphoma symptom and treatment side effect, we wanted to investigate how fatigue impacted the daily life of those who experience it. And what we found is that fatigue has huge impacts on patients' quality of life. So excluding their financial situation, which was 12%, more than 1/4 of patients in Canada reported experiencing each of the impacts that are listed in this figure because of their fatigue. More than half of patients in Canada reported that fatigue affected their general activity, their physical activity, and general work around the home. Patients in Canada who experienced fatigue were more affected in all the impact categories than patients globally, except for financial situation, employment, and mood. Compared to discussing treatment side effects generally, fewer patients in Canada and globally reported specifically discussing fatigue with their doctor, despite it being the top reported symptom and treatment side effect. Though we do see that more patients in Canada discussed their fatigue than globally. There are steps the doctor can take to help lessen a patient's fatigue, but they can't do so unless the patient makes the doctor aware of their fatigue. It's extremely important to discuss fatigue if it's something you are experiencing. Of those who did not discuss their fatigue, the top reported reasons in Canada and globally were not thinking anything could help, thinking they could deal with it on their own, and not thinking it was relevant to discuss. We also asked what the doctor did after patients discussed their fatigue. Unfortunately, the greatest amount of patients in Canada and globally reported that the doctor didn't take any action. Slightly more patients in Canada reported the doctor did do all of the other actions listed compared to patients globally. But still, this is less than 30% reporting any of these actions, which should be taken when a patient presents with fatigue according to clinical practice guidelines. Lymphoma Coalition created a fatigue report and a fatigue toolkit, which can be found on our website. These products give some background on cancer-related fatigue, the available treatments, clinical practice guidelines, and give tips on how to speak to your doctor about your fatigue, as well as how to request additional support and help if you feel like you are not receiving adequate support for this issue. If you're experiencing cancer-related fatigue, I do encourage you to check out these resources. You can also reach out to Lymphoma Canada for resources and support on this issue. Of those who experienced fatigue, the top reported coping mechanisms, both in Canada and globally, were balancing time schedules, exercise programs, and mind-body interventions. So this is things like yoga. Compared to patients globally, more patients in Canada reported using each of the coping mechanisms that we had listed. And it's encouraging to see that patients in Canada are being more proactive than the global average in managing this life-impacting issue for themselves. If you're interested in using digital applications for managing fatigue, the organization Tired of Cancer has created a free app called Untire, which helps cancer patients and survivors cope with extreme fatigue. You can download this for free in the Apple App Store or in the Google Play Store. So again, that is called Untire, and it is by the organization Tired of Cancer. Moving into the psychosocial effects of lymphoma, patients were asked if they had experienced any psychosocial issues over the past 12 months because of their lymphoma diagnosis. More than 15% of patients reported experiencing each psychosocial issue, both in Canada and globally. The top 3 issues reported by patients in Canada were fear of lymphoma relapse and progression. So the top 2 under none, those were 47% each in Canada, and anxiety, so just under fear of relapse, which was 30% in Canada. The same top 3 issues were reported for patients globally. Compared to patients globally, fewer patients in Canada reported each psychosocial issue except for fear of lymphoma progression. The amount of patients experiencing fear of lymphoma progression, which was 47% in Canada, may reflect the large amount of patients in the Canadian population who had slow-growing lymphomas, so like follicular, CLL, or Waldenstrom's, and who reported being in active surveillance. In the 2018 survey, 4 main psychosocial issues were identified to ask more questions about in the 2020 survey, including depression, anxiety, changes in relationships, and fear of cancer relapse. We asked patients who reported experiencing these issues if they had discussed them with their doctor. While more patients in Canada reported discussing each issue compared to patients globally, This is still significantly less than the amount of patients who reported discussing treatment side effects or fatigue with the doctor. And this is a consistent theme we see every survey. So patients are much more inclined to discuss their physical and medical issues with the doctor than their psychosocial or emotional issues. It's important for patients to bring these issues to light with their doctor if they're going to be met with the appropriate support or referrals onto appropriate support. Though doctors cannot address all the emotional and psychosocial issues that patients may be experiencing, they can make referrals onto sources of support that can help. But none of this can happen unless patients do speak up about the emotional and psychosocial issues that they're experiencing, even if they seem irrelevant to discuss in a medical context. Patients who experienced fear of relapse were asked which associated thoughts and feelings they experienced. And all of the thoughts and feelings that are listed in this figure were taken from clinical practice guidelines and represent clinically significant fear of cancer relapse. More than 10% of patients in Canada reported experiencing each of these thoughts and feelings as a result of their fear of relapse. So 88% of patients in Canada report that they think about the cancer returning, 65% examine themselves for physical signs of cancer, and a quarter have difficulty making plans for the future. Of those who experienced fear of relapse, the top reported coping mechanisms, both in Canada and globally again, were exercise programs, mind-body interventions, and psychoeducation or therapy. Compared to patients globally, like was seen in fatigue, more patients in Canada reported using each of the coping mechanisms that were listed, but nearly a third of patients in Canada still reported using no coping mechanisms. Given that many patients reported experiencing feelings and thoughts that were associated with clinically significant fear of cancer relapse, and that less than 60% of patients in Canada or globally are discussing their fear of relapse with their doctor, it's important for patients and doctors to take steps towards discussing and addressing this issue. Lymphoma Coalition has also created a fear of relapse report and toolkit, which can be found on our website. Again, these contain background information on the issue, as well as tips for discussing fear of relapse with the doctor and how to request additional support. When looking at how patients manage their healthcare overall, the factor that influences patients' healthcare decision-making the most in Canada and globally is recommendations from healthcare providers. But something that stood out is that compared to patients globally, far fewer patients in Canada reported that financial considerations impacted their decision-making. So that's circled in red, and that was 8% of patients globally versus only 1% of patients in Canada. And we think this is largely reflective of Canada's universal publicly funded healthcare system. China and the United States were in the top 3 countries represented in the global population that we're comparing against. So China and some other countries across Asia have out-of-pocket healthcare systems relating to cancer care, which creates really high stress and has large financial impacts for patients. We know that many middle-class households in Asia can face impoverishment after paying for cancer care. So it makes sense that finances play a role in the healthcare decisions that they're making. In the US, the mainly privatized system can create similar issues for patients if they are not covered under insurance. When asked how confident patients felt in managing their health and condition day to day, about a third of patients in Canada were very confident and half were very confident, as seen on the pie chart on the left. More patients in Canada reported being confident than patients globally. So 83% in Canada being very or fairly versus 72% in global being very or fairly confident. And less patients in Canada reported not being confident. So only 7% of patients in Canada reported not being confident versus 17% globally. Additionally, the majority of patients in Canada reported being confident in their ability to positively impact their health. So the bar in the middle, which was 79%, and less patients in Canada reported feeling overwhelmed by managing their health or waiting until health issues can no longer be ignored before seeking help, compared to globally. And despite reporting these negative feelings less than globally, still this is a fifth of people who are reporting feeling overwhelmed by managing their health or waiting to seek help for medical issues until they can no longer be ignored. Okay, so now we'll move into the caregiver results, which will be displayed the same way as the patient results. So with the Canadian caregivers compared to the global average. Respondents fell under the caregiver category if they indicated they were a caregiver, friend, or family member of someone who has lymphoma or CLL. And beginning with the demographics, there were more female caregivers than male, both in Canada and globally. But in Canada, this ratio is a little bit more skewed. You can see at the top that nearly 80% of caregivers in Canada were female, compared to about 60% of caregivers globally. There were far fewer caregivers in the younger age category in Canada compared to globally. Only 11% of caregivers in Canada were under the age of 39. 70% of caregivers in Canada were between the ages of 40 and 69 years old. Canada had more representation of the oldest age group as well. So nearly a fifth of caregivers in Canada were 70 plus, compared to only 5% of caregivers globally. Something I wanted to point out is that nearly 2/3 of caregivers in the global patient population were from Asia Pacific. So it's really important to acknowledge the role of family in the patient experience in Asia and how it may affect the results. In China, for example, the law holds medical practitioners legally responsible for any adverse events patients may experience because of the disclosure of a cancer diagnosis. So if they tell the patient they have cancer and something bad happens to the patient that might be self-inflicted, the physician would be responsible. And because of this, physicians typically disclose the diagnosis to the family of the patient and let the family decide if the patient will be notified. And in many cases, the family will prefer to hide the diagnosis from the patient in order to protect them from any emotional harms. This occurs not only in China, but also in countries throughout Asia to varying degrees. So given that patients' families are often the sole information holders and communicators, it holds that they may face greater burdens as a caregiver. Most caregivers in Canada were providing care and support to their spouse, while 11% were providing care to their child and 8% to their parent. While most caregivers globally were also caring for their spouse, far more were caring for their parent than was reported in Canada. So the number 3 here, 34% globally versus 8% in Canada. About half of caregivers in Canada had been providing care to their patient for between 2 and 10 years. Compared to caregivers globally, the Canadian caregiver sample was made up of people who had been caring for their patient for longer time periods. Nearly half of caregivers globally had only been providing care for a year or less. These were the top 5 types of care that caregivers in Canada reported providing. 4 of these were in the top 5 reported for global caregivers, but providing transport was not. Instead, 61% of caregivers globally reported that they talked to healthcare professionals on the patient's behalf, which kind of fits with what I explained earlier about the culture of Asian caregiving. And as you can see, the top 4 care types that were the same for Canada and global, so emotional support, accompanying to appointments, looking for information, and running errands. More caregivers in Canada reported providing that care than globally. And in fact, all the care types we listed to pick from in the survey, the only types that Canadian caregivers reported less than global caregivers were giving medication, helping with bathing and dressing, and babysitting or caring for children or dependents. So generally, more caregivers in Canada are providing more types of care than globally. Caregivers in Canada reported that emotional, financial, and physical care were the hardest to provide. Global caregivers reported that financial, emotional, and practical care were the hardest to provide. You can see that far more caregivers in Canada thought that emotional support was difficult to provide, and far less caregivers in Canada thought that financial support was difficult to provide. And as I had mentioned earlier, many countries in Asia do have an out-of-pocket healthcare system as it pertains to cancer care. So this may be a reflection of this given the large percentage of caregivers from Asia and China specifically in the sample. This may require caregivers to actually contribute financially to the patient's care. And also, as we pointed out in the demographics, the global caregiver population was much younger than the Canadian caregiver population, which might mean that they need more time off work, they have more financial instability, or they need to support more dependents like children. The top 3 information sources for caregivers were the same as was observed for patients. Doctors, websites, and patient organizations were the top places that caregivers sourced their information both in Canada and globally. We asked caregivers who looked for information about the patient's condition and treatment after their diagnosis. So most caregivers in Canada reported that they looked for the information together with the patient, so the 3rd bar from the top. Most caregivers globally reported looking for the information by themselves, so the very bottom bar there. And this could reflect what I explained earlier about the culture of caregiving in Asia, in that many patients might not be privy to all the details of their diagnosis and condition. So it's the caregivers who are actually seeking out the information about their disease and treatment options. Also, less patients in Canada reported that they don't seek information beyond what the doctor tells them. So the 2nd bar from the top. And while the notion that doctors are the experts and shouldn't be questioned certainly does exist in Canada, it can exist to a higher degree in certain regions and countries around the world. For example, in Asia, or more specifically in India, where doctors are really equated with gods, and to question them or to ask further information would be a really high form of disrespect. More caregivers in Canada were definitely satisfied with the information they received from healthcare providers, so 56% versus 38% globally. The caregiver role might not be as recognized in certain places around the world. And across Asia, for example, it is common for doctors to have really limited time with a patient and their caregiver, even in a diagnosis meeting, and we're talking less than 5 minutes. So there's not a lot of opportunity to gain a lot of understanding or ask additional questions or request additional information, even if you feel like you need it. These are the top 5 impacts of caregiving that caregivers in Canada reported experiencing often or always. Compared to caregivers globally, fewer caregivers in Canada reported each of these impacts. More than half of caregivers in Canada reported often or always fearing that the patient's cancer will relapse. So this was the most reported impact for caregivers in Canada. And it's important to acknowledge that fear of cancer relapse does not just affect patients, it also affects their caregivers and their families. You can see that as 3/4 of caregivers globally reported experiencing fear of cancer relapse. So that was the top reported global impact as well. So we also asked caregivers who experienced fear of cancer relapse which associated thoughts and feelings they experienced. Again, these were all taken from research and are associated with clinically significant fear of relapse. More than 16% of caregivers in Canada who experienced fear of relapse also reported experiencing all of these thoughts and feelings. So we would also encourage caregivers to take advantage of the resources on fear of relapse that we have on our website. It's really important to address fear of relapse and employ coping mechanisms or tools in order to lessen the burden of your fear. And we encourage you to reach out again to Lymphoma Canada for resources and support. Out of all the potential impacts listed in the survey, these 6 impacts were the biggest differences I noticed between caregivers in Canada and globally. So a large percentage of caregivers globally are experiencing financial hardship, which is circled, and they are needing to take time off work to care for their patient. This is the case for less than 15% of caregivers in Canada in both of these cases. And compared to caregivers globally, fewer Canadian caregivers reported experiencing difficulty managing health administrative tasks with their patient. And fewer reported being sad and depressed, but more Canadian caregivers reported changes in their relationship with the patient. From the differences observed throughout this caregiver results section, it seems as though caregivers in Canada are reporting a higher emotional burden of caregiving than globally. So more caregivers in Canada reported providing emotional support to the patient. They're reporting their relationship changing with the patient. And when asked which area of their life has been affected most by caregiving overall, 90% of caregivers in Canada reported emotional versus only 61% of caregivers globally. Again here, so while more caregivers in Canada reported feeling assisted, supported, understood, and recognized in their role by healthcare professionals, less felt the same from their family and friends compared to caregivers globally. So evidently, caregivers in Canada could benefit more from more emotional and psychosocial support right from the beginning of their caregiver experience. Okay, and to summarize some key findings we saw in the patient and caregiver survey results. So credible information is really important to patients and caregivers early in the lymphoma experience and makes a difference throughout their patient experience. Doctors do play a central role both in making decisions about treatment and as well as information provision and communication, but their time is limited and they cannot provide all the information and support that patients need. Communication gaps exist surrounding psychosocial issues. Patients continue to struggle with fatigue, and patients and caregivers with fear of cancer relapse. And we think that patient organizations are a key point of contact, which are really uniquely positioned to educate and improve patient care and experience. So we really encourage you to take advantage of the services and resources they offer. So what do we do with the data we collect? So Lymphoma Coalition, for us, the Global Patient Survey is a really critically important tool. Not only do we use the results to guide the planning of our projects and advocacy initiatives for the 2 years that follow, we also use the data to develop and supplement unique reports and toolkits that go to our membership and across the healthcare community. For example, so because this survey took place in January to March of 2020, where COVID-19 lockdowns were in full swing in many countries across Asia, we were able to do a really interesting analysis of patients in Asia who were newly diagnosed versus diagnosed more than 6 months ago to see how COVID may have impacted patients during the different stages of their experience. This information can be found in our 2020 report card on our website. Also, having credible, scientifically robust information and data has allowed us to publish our work in the form of abstract posters and presentations at many blood cancer focused conferences. Through this, we have made significant progress toward raising the credibility of the patient voice and perspective among the healthcare, pharmaceutical, and scientific communities. And this goes a long way in terms of how we'll be able to contribute towards meaningful change in the future. And what our members do with the data. So the initiatives listed on this slide are a selection of what our members have done with the Global Patient Survey data in their specific countries. The data has really mainly been used for advocacy among our member countries. And beyond what's listed here, House 086, which is our member group in China, used the data to bring recognition to the worser patient experience of patients in China compared to the rest of the world. This resulted in their CEO being asked to be part of a government committee to advise on how this situation can be improved. Our member group in Australia used the data as part of the formation and ongoing work of the Blood Cancer Task Force, which was formed to deliver Australia's first national strategic action plan for blood cancer. New Zealand was able to use the data to write a report which brought to light the different experience for Aboriginal patients with lymphomas within their country. And there are many more initiatives, both big and small, that have used the Global Patient Data Survey or the data from the Global Patient Survey in some way. So it's a great tool not only for us, but for our membership if they choose to use it. And for the next steps, the LC Global Patient Survey, the next one will launch in January of 2020, and we welcome and encourage you to participate. Also, all the resources I referenced throughout the presentation can be found on our website, which is listed right at the bottom here. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and thank you, Lymphoma Canada, for having me.